So, ShaunLoney.
Good morning, Christine.
Good morning. How are you, Shaun?
I'm great. It's nice to see you and chat with you.
And it's wonderful to see you. Now, we've done a bit of introduction already for you, but can you just share a bit with the audience, maybe your background and your connection to Northwestern Ontario, because you have a few connections.
Yes, I do. I'm very pleased to be making connections in Red Lake. I have a few cousins there, as you know. Jennifer and Alan Burkowski are both my cousins, and Kevin Harland, which is kind of fun, and many memories of visiting Red Lake when I was a kid, and more recently, and also looking forward to coming to Red Lake again to do a workshop later. So that's kind of cool. But I grew up in Emo, so not that far away, and right next to the Rainy River First Nation. And so I think a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is really figuring out my connections with the Rainy River First Nation. Some are obvious and some less so. I believe that the privilege that I have, economic privilege that I have, is directly related to the demise of the local economy at Rainy River First Nation. And I think that that's important for some of us to acknowledge that, some of us think that we hit a triple while we're standing on first base or on third base, and really we got a heck of a head start. And I feel a bit that's what it's like for me. And so in Northwestern Ontario, it's just a significant Indigenous population, and by all accounts, they're not able to participate in the economy as much as the rest of us. And I think as Canadians, that's our defining issue, is connecting the people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. And in Northwestern Ontario, there's lots of things to do. So the message that I'm talking about through our book is, I think, directly speaks to that.
Wonderful. Well, why don't you sort of talked about problem solving and bringing people into the economy, and you've just written a book called An Army of Problem Solvers. So why don't you share a bit more about that? We really are interested in learning your perspective.
Sure. And can you see my screen, Christy?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm just getting a message. Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll get rolling here. So this is the cover of the book. There should be a few copies around there. They're available for $20 each, and the funds go to support social enterprise development. But you can see in the front is a picture of our farm crew at the Garden Hill First Nation, which I'll be talking about. And in the bottom left is a picture of the CEO of Aki Energy, and Darcy Wood, and now I'm going to talk a bit about Aki Energy as well. But here's a picture of one of my group of coworkers, Build. Build is now 10 years old. We talk about an army of problem solvers. These are folks that have Build, anyway, has reduced utility bills at 17,000 low-income households over 10 years. So they're doing mostly insulating and water retrofits in the inner city in Winnipeg, and mostly Indigenous and mostly male, but also some refugees and women, of course, part of the team. But we've now started 12 different social enterprises, most of them in Manitoba. We'd certainly love to help folks get going in the Red Lake area. But we're headquartered here at the Social Enterprise Center. It's in the North End in Winnipeg. This is an old CPR mail sorting facility, and it's 30,000 square feet, and we call it an industrial hub. It's full of social enterprises, and you can see Build's logo there in the upper left. I'll talk a bit about the others, as Manitoba Green Retrofit is part of the crew as well. And you can see the Manitoba Green Retrofit logo they hire builds graduates, and it's celebrating 7 years old this year, and they have a annual payroll of almost $1.5 million now. So we're pretty proud of that as well. The main thing that we're trying to that we're working with is just seeing that where there's a lot of poverty, which is certainly true in First Nations in Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, and experienced by a lot of Indigenous people off the res, is that the money just comes in and it just goes right back out. One of our board members at Key Energy says that the money just flows off brown hands, and I like this picture because it just money, goods and services coming in, and then the money just goes right back out. And energy and food being the two main areas, I think, where money goes back out. Also hiring contractors from outside, and we're going to talk today about how to reverse the leakage in all three of those areas today. And we like to say that it's akin to plugging the leaky bucket and then having the money circulate, and in the end, that's what reduces poverty. And that's how we can create strong local economies, which of course are the hallmark of Indigenous economies. Before contact, this is basically a description of how economies worked. And as I mentioned before, there's so much work to be doing in Northwestern Ontario, and so many people who need work. Our defining issue is really connecting those people who most need to work with the work that most needs to be done. These are a couple of my former coworkers from Build. You can see they've just insulated a basement, and I like to call these guys the $1 million men. Yeah, just because of the enormous amounts of public money that goes into unhealthy outcomes, and wherein in fact they actually make excellent coworkers and really good contributors to society, fantastic dads and so on. They just need a chance to get rolling, and so that's what we're talking about today. So what we've all forgotten, governments have forgotten anyways, is that you need a problem solver to solve a problem. And I see the problem solvers coming in three different categories. There's social entrepreneurs, and I like to think of people who might have a solar company or a biomass company. A high profile example of a social entrepreneur would be Elon Musk from Tesla, that is making all the electric vehicles and transforming that industry. We also see the local food movement is very important and has been a very important part of Indigenous economies. Of course, all Indigenous economies at one time provided enough food for their local populations, local communities. The problem solver I'm going to talk most about today is social enterprises, and they're really neat economic ventures because generally they're nonprofit on one hand, but they are also use entrepreneurial and private sector tools, and you combine both of those in one entity. And in a First Nation setting, sometimes we have chief and council that is trying to operate businesses, but it generally, at least in my experience, doesn't work very well. And so social enterprises are separate from chief and council, and they can appoint somebody to the board, but the boards are generally elected and determined outside the chief and council process. And so it kind of starts to get away from the Indian Act. It also gets away from that two-year cycle of electing new leadership. And then after all, chief and councils are administrative bodies, and they have an awful lot to worry about other than trying to run businesses. So we have found this to be successful. In a more urban setting like Red Lake, social enterprises can be run by an existing nonprofit or a new nonprofit started in order to do that. So social enterprises, they're becoming more popular. We're going to talk more about the ones we've started in Manitoba and elsewhere, but there are 1,500 social enterprises in Scotland. And so in some places, governments have really made focusing on problem solvers a priority. And but that's generally a description of what social enterprises are. I mean, you might have some that are social enterprises operating in northwestern Ontario that maybe don't call themselves a social enterprise, but this is certainly something that's going to be more popular going forward. So I can give you a little tidbit. I noticed on Facebook on the weekend that there's a new social enterprise started in Portage la Prairie. It was a group that was raising funds and still is raising funds to support kids to play hockey that otherwise wouldn't have the money to buy equipment and pay registration fees. And they started so they decided they wanted to make some revenues as opposed to just asking for funding, which is of course still important. But so they started a social enterprise cleaning hockey equipment, and so that's a new social enterprise in Portage la Prairie. So it's pretty cool, and there's lots of ways to earn these revenues. So we've talked a bit about build, and we've talked about Manitoba Green Retrofit, and we're going to focus on Aki Energy as well. Aki is, as many of you know, is an Ojibwe word for earth, so earth energy, which is really kind of created by Build and Manitoba Green Retrofit, but is focusing mostly on First Nations. And so I think all of these have some relevance to northwestern Ontario. But Brandon, Manitoba has a social enterprise called BEEP, Brandon Energy Efficiency Program, and they're actually changing their name because they're doing much more than
Okay, you have frozen right now.
I can hang on for a second. Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're back. We had a freeze happening, but you're back, so carry on.
Maybe we need a new social enterprise in northwestern Ontario providing cellular service. What's the last thing you heard me say, Christine?
You were just saying that the Brandon Social Enterprise was changing its name because they were doing more than...
Yeah. So, yeah, Brandon Energy Efficiency Program is actually building new houses for the Canadian Mental Health Association. Mm-hmm. So they're getting lots of experience building homes, but they also do other things, including apartment maintenance, so painting and drywalling and so on. Building Up is based in Toronto, and it is now over 2 years old, 2.5 years old. They've done 5,000 water retrofits, and they're also getting into apartment maintenance, which is pretty cool. And Impact Construction is in St. John's, Newfoundland, and we expect that within a couple of years to be one of the largest residential contractors in St. John's, which is pretty cool. And they're actually building homes for apartments, I should say, for some of their workers. So they're able to create employment by building the housing and also reaching further into the labor market. But all of them are kind of focused on reducing utility bills as a core practice. So anything from installing high efficient natural gas furnaces, doing water retrofits, installing solar, and collectively we've lowered utility bills by about $7.5 million per year, and have reached 25,000 low-income households. So that's an example of connecting the people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. And you can see in this picture, the homeowner standing in the middle with the baby, and the folks that have insulated the basement around her. And I think this is a good example of what reconciliation looks like, because she phoned me after the retrofit and said, I feel safer in my home now. And I thought, wow, how in the world could an insulation retrofit make her feel safer? But she says, oh, when I see these guys on the street now, I see friends that I haven't met yet. And so kind of also a way to bring bring people together. And I know Red Lake in many ways is very close knit, but I think this would be a good example to get a good place for people to be pushing in the same direction. This is not new to what we're doing. This is a great poster I love from Minnesota and from Winona LeDuc. And I know, Christine, you'll be very familiar with Winona. She, her First Nation's in Minnesota called White Earth First Nation, and they're selling raspberries, gardening stuff, blueberries, maple syrup, bison meat. They also have solar and wind power. So launching a green economy for brown people, I think, is a very excellent tool. Excellent way to think about it. So when we're training people for employment, we're not just focusing on a work experience. We have other things, but in the center of what we do is a cultural focus. So we do a lot of sweats and ceremonies and have elders that are working with all of us. But it can't just be about work experience. We focus a lot on financial literacy, so people have the tools to know how to manage their money. When people leave Build, for example, they've been there for 6 months, they'll have a bank account and a savings plan, and we think that's to get money working for you rather than the other way around, you working for the money. So the financial literacy is a really important component. Driver's licensing is huge. And in our estimation, 75% of job postings require a driver's license. And so when people sign up to work with us, they understand that getting their driver's license is a key component of that. And I guess I'd just like to say that for a lot of people, getting a driver's license is very easy. My kids right now, my second son is just completing his driver's training. It's $50 at high school. When he signed up, he had his ID already. He didn't have any penalties to pay back, so there were no restrictions. He was able to get this studying done at school in order to pass the beginner's test. And his parents have a car and licenses that can take him out practice driving. But these aren't the experience of a lot of people that don't have employment right now. It's much more difficult to get a driver's license. And so I think in the years to come, I and others will start to push harder, especially the federal government, working with provincial arms to say that everyone in Canada should have access to driver's training. If we're wanting and expecting people to get employment, but 75% of jobs require a driver's license, and these folks don't have a driver's license, then I think we're really missing the obvious. So driver's licensing is an important part of what we do. And what we're focusing on, of course, is trades-based work, but we do what we do around trades-based. So we teach trades-based literacy. So people are working on their grade 12 math, but realizing that the math is very relevant. If you're going to build a set of stairs, you need to know how to calculate a slope. If you want to order concrete for a circular hole, you need to be able to figure out the volume in order to order the right amount of concrete. If you want to do billing, you need to be able to do a bit of basic algebra to calculate an invoice. So trades-based literacy is also very, very important. So just kind of give you an idea. I mean, we also have Bring Your Kid to Work Day, so kids can see where the parents work and what it is that they're doing. Lots of. We think this is a Indigenous paradigm of training and promoting employment. So one of the things I was thinking would be helpful, and you'll see more at the end of the presentation what I'm gearing towards here, but I talk in the book about these poverty myths. I believe that there are three, and the first poverty myth that I wanted to talk about today is that we keep hearing this over and over again, that there isn't enough money. And so to make this a bit more fun, I've got a Jeopardy approach here. So we've got an answer to a question, which is $80,000. And I'd just like for you to kind of think amongst yourselves a bit. What would the question be that you'd want to answer? $80,000. Would you say, well, that is the annual incarceration cost per prisoner? Would you say that that's the approximate annual cost per dialysis patient, or would you say that that's the approximate annual cost per child in the so-called child welfare system? So let you mull that over for a minute.
Oh,
which of those three do you think would be? Christine, maybe I'll ask you, what do you think is the correct question to the answer?
All of the above?
That is correct. I'm putting you on the spot. I never thought that I could do that.
Well, I wasn't sure if you were asking me. Now I see you were probably asking everybody, but yes,
yeah, I was.
Carry on.
I thought, well, why don't we pick Christine out of the crowd? So yeah, yes, you're correct. I mean, it varies a bit, but approximately, just to think about that for a minute, it costs $80,000 to keep somebody locked up for a year. $80,000 per year, and it's $220,000 per jail cell, the capital cost to build that. Diabetes is a massive problem on First Nations. It's a big problem in Northwestern Ontario. The Premier of Manitoba is saying that within, I think he said 15 years, that 37% of Manitobans are going to have diabetes. And it's probably going to be much higher even on First Nations. So the dialysis, wow, at Garden Hill, there's 38 people on a dialysis waiting list. And in the north, the cost isn't $80,000 per year. It's more like $100,000 per year. But in many First Nations, diabetes was unheard of in the 1970s. So what's going on here? And yes, it costs about $1.8 million to raise a baby from baby to age 18 in the child welfare system. In Manitoba, we have 8,900 Indigenous kids in care. And Northwestern Ontario, it's a big, big issue. And these are the things that the Indigenous community is dealing with. But we're going to learn a bit this morning about how not to get daunted by those problems, because what we need to do is just focus on the problem solvers. And these things we're slowly going to begin, well, actually, I think quickly going to begin to tackle these and other issues. But don't ever let anyone say there isn't enough money. There's tons of money. It's being spent on the wrong things. Okay, Christine, here's another one. So just again, focusing on the fact there isn't enough money. So what question would you answer 75%? What is the percentage of healthcare costs on diseases where diet is a main risk factor? What is the recidivism rate in Manitoba? Recidivism is a word meaning the reoffense rate. So at what rate, when people get out of jail, are they back in contact with the justice system within 2 years? And what is the percentage of inmates in Manitoba who are Indigenous? And my guess in this is probably even higher in Northwestern Ontario. So what are your comments on that, Christine?
Well, at the risk of being repetitive, is it all of the above?
You're correct. Most people in the first one don't answer all the above. They kind of struggle and pick out one, but you're ahead of the curve. So just think about this for a minute, that 75% of our healthcare expenditures are now on diseases where diet is a main risk factor. If we're worried about our healthcare spending, we've got to do something about our collective diet. And yes, something like 75% of inmates, when they get out of jail in Manitoba, are back in contact with the justice system within 2 years. That is an epic failure. It's just an epic, unmitigated failure. It's a brutal, brutal stat. And to think that in Manitoba, where we have 15% of our population is Indigenous, but nearly 75% of our inmates are Indigenous, that is a brutal, brutal stat. And so I think that in some ways, when Grand Chief Sheila North Wilson from the Northern Manitoba First Nations um, talks about Manitoba at least being one of the most racist governments in Canada. I mean, maybe how she expressed it was helpful, maybe it wasn't helpful, but these are the kind of stats I think that are behind what it is that she's trying to say. But wow, like what a massive amount of money we're spending on problems. So don't let anybody ever say that there isn't enough money. That's a myth, and we need to move away from that. And I call that the first of the three poverty myths. The second thing is that Canadians, I think, believe is that low income people don't want to work. And it might appear that way because they're not working, but that doesn't necessarily cause the reverse isn't true. And all of the now 12 social enterprises we've started, we have massive waiting lists of people wanting to work. This is a picture in the North End in Winnipeg at 7:30 in the morning. We're hiring for 8 temporary demolition jobs, and wow, like we there's no possible way we can keep up to the demand for people wanting to work. So don't let anybody ever say that low income people and or Indigenous people don't want to work. I've seen people who don't have the confidence to work, or don't have the training to work, or might have some other barriers preventing them, maybe just don't know how to get started, or are lacking some of the work skills. But this is where social enterprises come in to kind of fill in where those barriers are. But wow, people want to work, and I think that's a pretty exciting thing for Northwestern Ontario. The third poverty myth, I think the thing that has struck me the most, is that we hear quite often that poverty has causes. We hear we got to get at the root causes of poverty, and this is Jane Jacobs, and Christine, you'll be familiar with her, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So she wrote a lot about cities and urban planning, and how if we keep building our lots of urban sprawl, we're going to run into problems, and with infrastructure costs, and she was so correct about that. And well, people at the time, 1960s, said, "Oh, this is a crazy old lady. She doesn't know what she's talking about." It turned out to be true. Well, she also said that poverty has no causes. And I thought, wow, when I read that, it's like, Jane, I worship you, but that's just so wrong. Of course, poverty has causes. Everything we've always been taught about poverty has causes. And in fact, I think she's right. And she says that darkness has no causes. It's the absence of light. And cold has no causes. It's the absence of heat. And poverty is nothing more than the absence of prosperity. And so we need to be focusing on prosperity rather than poverty. And I'm wondering too, is if we're thinking about climate change in the wrong way. That maybe we need to be focusing on climate change being the absence of local economy, and really building local economies as part of the strategy to combat climate change, in addition to all the other things that we're doing. But local economy is pretty important. And if we want to deal with poverty, we've got to focus on prosperity. And so I think that's the third poverty myth. And Exhibit A, this is the bedbug remediation crew at Manitoba Green Retrofit. So just imagine that these are folks in Winnipeg that are largely working on bedbug remediation in North End of Winnipeg. And whoever would have thought that there's anything good about bedbugs? But in fact, at Manitoba Green Retrofit, no, we love bedbugs. It seems bizarre, but we're creating employment from something so horrible, and actually giving people the tools to move out of poverty. And so I wanted to point out on the far right, you see the guy with his hands crossed. That's Chris, and Chris was the guy in the earlier picture in the basement. And so has been a supervisor at Manitoba Green Retrofit for several years. This is an example of the kind of laddering effect that we've built in. And the bedbug analysis, I think, is a good example of what we really need to get serious about about social enterprises and just realizing there's two kinds of money. So Build in the beginning was a non-profit, and it still is a non-profit, but it was 100% government funded. And with government funding, there's just never enough of it and money. There's never enough to meet the demand. It's on again, off again. It's very high in administration. It's a recipe for low market penetration of whatever it is you're trying to do. But where the real game is being played and should be played and will be played in the future is all the other money that's being spent anyways on a regular basis. So money for utility bills would be a good example. Money that's spent on food would be a good example. And just looking around Red Lake, and you can hear the buzz of the economy there. All this money that's usually being spent. And so how is it as social enterprises that we can get into that game? And so the social enterprise that was announced on the weekend, they're starting in Portage Prairie, cleaning hockey equipment. I mean, this is not, when they're not asking for funding to grow, they're focusing on trying to get into the dollars that are regularly being spent. And so this is something that's really important to realize, that there's two kinds of money. So I want to talk a bit now about Aki Energy. So those are all urban examples. We started with Aki focusing on First Nations. These are pictures of our crews at I believe this is a Peguis First Nation, installing geothermal. Geothermal is, we sometimes call them heat pumps. We all have a heat pump in our house. It's our refrigerator. The black coils at the back of the refrigerator are dumping heat from inside the fridge chamber into the kitchen. And here you have Peguis First Nation installing that loop, those black coils underneath the frost line at Peguis. And so it's dumping heat from underneath the frost line into the house. And so sort of in a reverse manner from a refrigerator. And you don't always have to put the loop in the ground. And I know Red Lake's on Shield, we're actually installing a geothermal system in the lake at Northlands. And Northlands is a Dene community that has diesel hauled in every year for space heating and for generating electricity. So that black loop is being put in the lake, and several buildings heated and cooled from that. But we want, so I don't want you to look at these pictures and say, well, this isn't going to work in Red Lake. And if it's not, geothermal, it's solar or biomass. There's lots of different examples, but I just want to tell you a bit of the process about Aki Energy and why are we focusing on geothermal? Well, massive electricity reductions at 12,000 kilowatt hours per year. The work is very labor intensive. We love work that's labor intensive because it creates more employment. It's repetitive but medium skill, so people can feel like they're good at it in a hurry and be good at it. It provides both heating and cooling, and it's a known technology. I think often we're trying to address problems, we focus on technology. Oh, we need greenhouses on First Nations to grow more local food, or we need hydrogen or things that are fancy. No, we need problem solvers that are focusing on things that work and that we know that work. And the problem is a lack of problem solvers. It's not the lack of technology. So known technologies are what we generally focus on. And so a couple more pictures of getting ready to install a loop at Peguis, and we can talk more about that. But we've now installed $7 million worth of geothermal on 5 different First Nations, and without using any government funding. And so this is I'm going to spend some time on this. This is a really, really, really important tool. And I think that this is the tool that's going to solve poverty problems, climate change problems, child welfare. Is just kind of understanding how this works. And I've written a couple books. The first one is free on the internet, and it kind of focuses on this tool. So I touch on it in the second book, Army of Problem Solvers, in maybe a more readable fashion. But imagine the red. Let's just talk about utility bills for a minute. Imagine the red, so just like utility bills big. That's what that red bar is
Mm-hmm.
describing. So we go install the geothermal. It could be solar or biomass, and what happens is that the utility bills collapse. You'll see the red going from big to small. And what happens then is you have all this room left over. We call bill reductions, which are shown there. If you add up the yellow and the green, would be bill reductions. So to install geothermal, it costs maybe $20,000 per house. That varies. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. But let's say it's $20,000. So you get the money from a financial institution or from a foundation or from an investor to provide the $20,000 up front. And then what happens is that you can put a charge on the utility bill represented in yellow, which that can be collected over long periods of time. In the case of geothermal, we're collecting that over 20 years. And the financing fee is collected and until the investor is paid back their upfront money. And what's left over then is a bit of net bill reductions. So that the bill reductions aren't as big net as would otherwise be the case if it was government funding, and you wouldn't have to worry about the financing charge. But because it's not government funding, you can do a massive amount of work. So Fisher River Cree Nation has 500 houses. We've already done about 250 of their houses. We're halfway through installing with geothermal, and their bills are very low, and they've created a lot of employment. They're starting to do commercial installations, so they've already done their fitness center, car wash, and a health center, and they're beginning to work on the arena, which is pretty cool. So now you look at this pay-as-you-save financing and talk about it with child welfare. So you have $1.8 million that is spent to raise a child in the system from baby to age 18. Well, Indigenous nonprofits will tell you Indigenous child welfare is really focusing on keeping families together, which is actually relatively inexpensive, but there's never enough money, any money really, to keep families together, but lots of money to take children out of the house. So imagine governments using this system to say, well, to chief and councils or to Indigenous nonprofits, we're going to make sure we've got the money to help you keep families together, because we know that the savings are going to far exceed those costs up front. So this is how governments need to start focusing on, and then what you'll see is a problem solver is having the tools that they need to be successful. In the case of a homeowner, this is what their bill would look like. So their bill before the geothermal install is $300 per month. Their bill after is $275 per month. And the $275 includes a PACE financing fee of $75 per month, but the energy usage drops significantly, cut in half. Keep in mind too that as rates increase over the years, and Manitoba apparently we're having a 10% rate increases per year for a while, and that those rate increases are going to be put in a much smaller portion of the bill. So that's pretty exciting. The bill savings will increase as time goes on. Now, the cool thing about the pay-as-you-save system is that it allows us to get to scale. And just imagine that in Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario, that if we could knock off 10,000 homes at about $20,000 per home, that's $200 million in capital. It's $100 million in on-reserve labor. Like half of the cost of that $20,000 per house is labor. So just imagine that, $100 million in on-reserve labor, and the total net cost is the total net savings are much more than $20,000 per home. So we say that it's a negative cost. And so 2,500 person years of employment, which is going to start to cause the economic development process to go. So yes, you get the base employment, but you start growing businesses, and they then start doing work in other First Nations or doing work off First Nations, which is pretty cool. Massive reductions in electricity consumption. And of course, very good for climate change as well. In this case, 2,000 tons per year of emission reductions with a negative cost. The benefits actually outweigh the financial benefits actually outweigh the costs. So pretty cool. Now, in the book, I also talk about how INAC, which is, as you guys all know, the federal government department that oversees First Nations and is the interface between the federal government and First Nations. So they actually came along in May. I'm just going to pop back to this, and they said to Aki Energy, "We're not going to pay this financing fee anymore." And
Sorry.
that's okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So they actually told us they're not going to pay the financing fee anymore. So it's like, wow. They said if you want to do geothermal, you got to apply for funding. That's how the game works. And so in the book, I talk a lot about this guy called an Indian agent that used to be responsible for things that happened on First Nations. He was the Queen's representative.
Okay.
And part of the job of the Indian agent was actually to suppress local economies. He would not allow anything to be sold off First Nations without the permission of nothing could be sold off the First Nation without permission of the Indian agent. And if it was going to impact an outside venture, that the First Nation would be told you can't do that. So my own experience at Couchiching First Nation, I grew up close to there. They had a sawmill there. It was very successful, and the federal government actually came along and closed it down because it was competing with other sawmills in the area. And so I'll just give you kind of an example. There's also lots of experience of fishers and Indigenous fishers getting much less for their fish than non-Indigenous fishers. My grandmother grew up in southeastern Saskatchewan, and in the residential schools there, they actually trained people, residential school so-called students, people who went to residential school or forced to go to residential school. They trained them to be grain farmers, but when they started to be grain farmers, they're actually really good at it. But no one would buy their wheat locally, so they had to wagon it down into the U.S. Well, I think that this is a modern way of the federal government being an Indian agent. They're saying, no. You can't have transformative tools that are causing green energy companies to be booming on First Nations where they're hiring First Nations people. That's not the way to do things. If you want to do this, you got to apply for funding. We will tell you as bureaucrats whether or not this is a good idea, and we'll put it out for tender, and then we'll have non-Aboriginal companies apply for those tenders, and that's the proper way of doing it. So we said to them, look, you're telling us you're not going to pay this financing fee anymore. You're actually choosing high utility bills which create no employment over low utility bills which create employment. And so that's where we're at right now. It's a major battle with the federal government over this transformative tool, and we believe we're making progress. There's lots of people inside INAC are reading our book, Army of Problem Solvers, and they're realizing it's like, wow, there's a different way of doing things, and we can do things kind of First Nations on out rather than the other way around. And so we've got lots of great backers now across the country, which are putting a lot of pressure on INAC, and a lot of senior civil servants at INAC are excited about this. But we got to change the system so that this tool is available to all First Nations in northwestern Ontario, and I'm fairly confident to say today that we think that that's coming. So I wanted to talk a bit now about our food strategy. So that was a bit about our energy strategy, and I can talk a bit more. What I didn't include is some slides about Northlands, our Dene community in the very northwestern tip of Manitoba. But I may come back to that. I want to talk now about Garden Hill, and so I mentioned that Kevin and Alan and Jennifer are my cousins. Well, our grandparents grew up at Garden Hill First Nation, and that it's remote, so you can't drive to it. Um, this will sound very familiar to many of you. The population is growing very rapidly. There's a lot of diabetes there, massive amounts of unemployment, and we went there to kind of look at the possibility of doing some geothermal. And wow, what I saw, I'd never been there before, even though my grandparents lived there in the '60s. What I saw was just a massive diabetes problem, massive food problem. It's like, wow, how do we? What's the process? And so, well, you got to focus on problem solvers. And my coworker Darcy and I looked at each other, and he's a former chief of the Garden Hill First Nation, and we just looked at each other and said, I think we're in the food business. And so we started a farm, and this is an aerial shot of Garden Hill. It's very similar to northwestern Ontario. It's this beautiful, beautiful place, and you look around and see there's a northern store there that sells mostly unhealthy food, and shockingly, the federal government puts $1 million a year into a food subsidy program called Nutrition North Canada. $1 million per year into Garden Hill, and the northern store and the planes that supply the northern store get that money. And I'm going to talk briefly about that, but the program isn't working. I mean, you see it on the news, you see it in results of diabetes. The prices for healthy food are still super high. I don't need to. This slide I usually use for for less educated audiences than you folks are. You know that the system doesn't work, whether they're Nutrition North Canada, First Nations or not. Food is very expensive in the north, and we need to have more affordable food. Remember, I talked about how there isn't enough money. People say there's not enough money. Well, the money's being spent in the wrong places. Just imagine diabetes rates in Garden Hill are going up by 6% a year. 6% a year. Well, what does that mean? I mean, it's a doubling approximately every 13 or 14 years, and in the number of people. And there is no money available to reverse these trends. I'm talking nothing that is even worth mentioning, but massive amounts of money being spent into treating the problem. So it provides actually a really good opportunity to reverse this. And so we started a problem solver in Garden Hill. It's called Meacham. Meacham is a Oja Cree, probably it's Ojibwe as well, maybe even Cree, that means food. And so we have a farm, a healthy food market. We have a program where we're bringing kids from the school to the farm. And then we're just now this year starting a farm school. And this all started about we're going into our third year now. These are pictures from the farm. You can see, kids gardening, people learning how to farm, and bringing the gardens back to Garden Hill. And I mean, this is not a small venture. This is a size of the farm, an aerial shot of the area that was cleared, and it's just very exciting. And we don't have it all planted yet. We're probably this year going to get up to about 7 of the 13 acres, but we're getting there, and more each year. And just super exciting. There's another picture of the farm crew, and then the trainer that we've hired is Robert Guilford, that has been a really important part of this whole process. We also started a healthy food market. This is a picture of the early days of the market. We would just go into the TV station. You can see the TV on the left, and we just put healthy food out on the table, and just boom, it just sold. And we've got up to selling as much as $20,000 a month in fruits and vegetables and lean meat cuts. And people like it. And the prices we're selling at are well below what the Northern Store sells for, which is pretty cool. So we can talk a bit more about when I come to Red Lake about some of this process as well. But bringing the kids to the farm, here they are in school. They're growing their own seedlings and planting their own stuff at the farm, which is pretty cool. They have their own plots. Each class has their own plot at the farm, and they're bringing the veggies home to their parents. And it's kind of like how we learned to recycle. When I was a kid, it was the kids that were putting pressure on the parents. And so this is a process we're emulating at Garden Hill. And farm school, so we're starting to bring this year people from other First Nations to Garden Hill to learn both entrepreneurialism and also how to farm. And you can imagine the size of the markets in places like Garden Hill. There's 500 houses there. If each house bought just one chicken per week, that's a $250,000 chicken market per year just in Garden Hill. And imagine all the pesticide costs, the reduction of fossil fuels from not having to transport as much food up to the north, and reduce skills and employment and emotional well-being, all of which is an important part of what we're on about. And so, Christine, you might, if you had time, there's an 11-minute video on YouTube called the Meacham Project, which would be a good introduction, I think, to this whole process which we're describing. So if you go on YouTube and just put in the Meacham Project, it'll come up. It's just 11 minutes. There's a full documentary that's being prepared, but this is a professional movie trailer on the strategy. And so I just wanted to finish up today with a bit of an exercise, because we talked a bit about how poverty has no causes, and it really is an exciting process of beginning to see poverty in a different way. And I want to use the example of Garden Hill First Nation, and what we usually see when we look at poverty is we see a problem. We see in this way, we see at Garden Hill high food prices. There's a monopoly food retailer which is actually on an island, so the bad food is inconvenient. There's 500 people with diabetes at Garden Hill, probably growing by the day, basically there, and they've lost their food self-sufficiency. Massive amounts of unemployment and a growing population. This is what poverty looks like. And what I wanted to say today is that, let's just say for a minute we're going to do something about this problem. And while we know that governments aren't going to solve the problem, we've been down that road. What governments are doing is just servicing the problem. They're working on treating people with diabetes and dialysis and other food-related diseases. But if we're going to, and we know the private sector is not going to solve this problem, because they're not helping right now. They're just providing goods and services. And what we need is to promote employment and to have businesses that are doing things that benefit the community. So let's just say in our group here in Red Lake, in region in Northwestern Ontario, we're going to start to talk about creating a social enterprise. And this social enterprise is going to sell healthy food. It's going to grow healthy food. So Christine, I'm going to need your help with this a bit more, okay?
Okay.
So let's just say for a minute, we together are going to start a social enterprise that's going to focus on growing healthy food. It's going to focus on selling healthy food. The fact that there's high food prices, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
High food prices currently in Red Lake, or overall?
Well, just in the area. We have high food prices. This is a part of poverty as we're experiencing it. Mm-hmm. But if you want to start a business of growing healthy food and selling it, the fact that there's high food prices, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That you could see that it might be a good thing. It's certainly not a barrier, because people are used to paying high food prices. So for not very good food, so if you've got high quality food that is local, it may be not mass market, so priced that way. Spreading the cost out that way sometimes decreases the cost. Sometimes local organic food is more expensive. But I don't know. Is that the right answer?
Well, what I'm trying, that's
good margin for profit.
You did well on that. That's the answer that I usually get, because people are
Oh,
focused
okay.
on it from the perspective of a consumer. And
Okay.
what I'm saying is, when you look at prosperity, it's like, wow, we could start a business growing healthy food and selling it. And would you rather sell healthy, if you're growing, if you're in the business of growing healthy food and selling it, would you rather sell it, potatoes for 25 cents a pound, or in a place like Garden Hill where they're worth $2 a pound? Well, of course you'd be far more interested in growing and selling food in a place where you can get a good margin for profit, which is
That's true.
the place where
If
food
food,
prices are generally the highest.
yes, good point.
Okay, so this is what, let's
And
keep working through this. Okay, so in a lot of First Nations, they have a monopoly food retailer. So again, now we're not thinking about this from a consumer
okay,
perspective. We're thinking about this. You want to start a social enterprise. You want it to be successful. The fact that there's only one food retailer there, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
it's probably a good thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Why? Because the market is completely unsaturated. You would want to start a business where there isn't a ton of competition already. And so we're sort of two for two here. Like, this is looking up. Now, the food in Garden Hill is very inconvenient. As I was saying, in Garden Hill, the store is actually located on an island. So we located our healthy food market right on the res, and it gave us a competitive advantage over the Northern store, which is pretty neat. And you know, this is this is a tough one for people too, but I think it's important. So I'll get your help with this too, Christine. So there's 500 people with diabetes in Garden Hill. That's a huge problem. But if you're in the business of selling healthy food, is that a good thing or bad thing?
You've got a ready-made, built-in market.
Your customers are going to be very excited about buying your product. And so yes, that in the what we're trying to accomplish here is a good thing. Okay, the fact Garden Hill, they're no longer food self-sufficient. The other side of that is that, hey, they used to be. They have a very proud history of local food production. And in fact, all First Nations and Indigenous communities identify themselves that way. They used to uh, and are moving back in the direction of hunting, fishing, gardening, harvesting, all of these things. And imagine the employment that can be created by that, by looking at this in this way. So huge growing young populations, Christine. We want to start a healthy food operation. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good thing.
It's a good thing. Why?
Why are be sorry? Can you?
So
Why is there a
why?
good
I'll
thing
give
that
you
there
a
are
hint
people?
here. So why having these big local
Yes,
populations?
there's people to buy your food.
Exactly, it's a huge market for good food. And the last thing here, so that's pretty exciting. Big unemployment rates in First Nations. When I went to university, we were talking a lot about the free trade agreements, and these companies are wanting to move to Mexico and still have access to American and Canadian markets. And they're wanting to move to Mexico. Why?
Cheap labor, lots of
Cheap.
it.
Exactly. And so here we are in First Nations now with huge unemployment rates. And, you're looking at it not from a poverty perspective, but from a prosperity perspective. And what you see is a ready and willing pool of labor. It's
Yeah.
like, wow, okay, so this is interesting. We start to see what Jane Jacobs was talking about. It's like, maybe we should be, instead of focusing on the poverty, maybe looking at prosperity. And, you bundle all that stuff up. I like to call it the upside of down.
Hmm.
And you combine all these things together, and what you see is a really good place to start a social enterprise. And I use the example of Garden Hill here, but we could go through this exercise with anywhere we're experiencing poverty or lack of local economy, and see that actually, if we start to focus on not the problem but the problem solving process, that things become pretty exciting. And I like to call it the upside of down. And this is a good way to kind of look at all the various ways that we expend money on problems, and when in fact we could start demanding that government start to invest in problem solvers, and and we can start. We're a place like stinky hockey equipment in Porch Prairie is actually, there's something good about that. There's something good about bed bugs. There's something good about high utility bills. So this is the process of kind of thinking that through, and how exciting this can be. And I think that that's a place where we need to start in Northwestern Ontario, is saying, well, we need to start seeing poverty not as a problem, but as an opportunity. And that I think is where the prosperity, where the prosperity should start. And so, chief and councils, regional governments, like Red Lake municipality, provincial governments, federal governments, this all might sound a bit complicated, but really, we just need to make it easy for problem solvers. And allow the problem solvers access to the problem, allow them to tackle the problem. And I think that that's the fresh way of thinking that we're trying to propose. So with that, Christine, I think is a bit of an introduction to an army of problem solvers, and just very excited about what the possibilities are. I'm hoping to make a trip to Scotland in the next year or so, just to kind of get our heads around, well, wow, what did you do to end up with 1,500 social enterprises, 1,500 problem solvers in such a small country? And I also think that now that we've started and we've got a bunch of social enterprises going and moving in that direction, that'll be easier to add on as governments are starting to get more used to, and consumers are starting to get more used to social enterprises as options. So I hope that you found that discussion helpful. But is there anything, Christine, that you wanted to add, or that you think that I should be building upon, or things that weren't clear that I could clarify?
No, I am very excited about your whole perspective, and the light, like you said, you're shifting from the problem to the problem solvers. And for me to hear you say climate change is the absence of local economy, of course, as somebody very concerned about climate change, that's really a new perspective for me. And I can see why you're so busy that we can't get you up to Red Lake this week, but I'm very excited about the possibility of you coming up later on in the month, or possibly in June, because I can see that this presentation is just going to spark a whole lot of conversations and ideas in our communities. So I'm really excited that you were able to take the time to do this, and that we can explore, hopefully with you further, what it means to Red Lake specifically. I don't know if you want to comment just briefly about, you've got me on your main screen. Thank you.
You're doubled up there.
We don't want to scare everybody now.
You should be able to see me now.
Yes, that's wonderful. Because you've been traveling across the country. I know you were in Newfoundland recently, and this week you're going to be in Alberta and in BC. So it seems like people are receptive to your message. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think that we've just got daunted by problems, and it's like, wow, there's problems everywhere. Like, we can't possibly do anything about all these problems. And just to kind of simplify things, like, no, we can do lots about them, and we can be very successful at that. We can solve many problems at once, but only if problem solvers have an easy go of it, and if there are problem solvers, right? So, I mean, I think when I do come out to Red Lake, if you folks are interested in that, we can sit down around a table and kind of talk a bit about, well, what would this look like in this region? What is the main problem that we would want to solve? Well, maybe it's Indigenous unemployment. My guess is that's probably what it's all about. And then, well, okay, so those are the the folks we want to engage in this process. And then, what is the widget that we would most want them to work? Maybe it's food. I don't know. And I think what happens in that process is like, wow, we're actually doing something about climate change here, because we're reducing the amount of, because local economy is naturally going to cause a reduction in fossil fuel consumption. So in that way, we can all see where we can get into the solution and benefit what it is that we're trying to get at. And then just allowing that, small kind of seed to then grow to something more significant, and allow that local economic development process to unfold. So this is what we could talk about at a later time, and if people are interested in that, and it just kind of, people have time to read the book as well, and for it to kind of sink in, I think, as to the experience that we're sharing. Well, this is what we're seeing, and and how can our experience be shared? So in Toronto, Building Up actually is a partnership with the Black Daddies Club. So in the context of the particular neighborhood that said, we need jobs for our Black dads, well, we need to start a social enterprise. So they just kind of took our experience and then adopted it there. So that's, I think we can do the same thing in Red Lake, is to find, okay, well, this is what, we've learned, the social enterprise community already. How can we export that to Northwestern Ontario? And I would love to be a part of that process.
And it's sort of, the process sounds like it's from the grassroots. It's engaging the community to find out, they identify where the biggest issue is, and then start problem solving. Is that at that level? Is that
yes, using economic tools.
Yeah. Wow.
So how can we use business tools to solve this problem? Because the cool thing about the business tools is then you get into all this other money that's being spent all the time.
Yeah. And
then you can get to scale. We've got so many exciting things happening, but so little of it is to scale. There might be a geothermal system at a band office, or a solar panel at a band office, or a community gardening plot, or a house with a biomass system. Great. How do we make that so that they're everywhere, right? And that's what's cool. We can begin to institutionalize these solutions so that it's like, wow, there's a house without a solar panel. Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
I wonder, they must be replacing their shingles or something for there not to be a solar panel there. So
I love that.
There's somebody that's driving a non-electric vehicle. That's weird, like that's what we need to get to. And we're only going to get there if we use entrepreneurial skills.
I love that. Wow. Well, I hate to bring this conversation to a close, but I know you are a busy man, and my computer is telling me that my hard drive is getting full because of all the recording. So I better stop before it cuts me off completely. Thank you so much for chatting this morning, and for everything you're doing. It makes me feel happy just to know that you're out there doing that. So
yeah, well, we all are. Well, we're all on the same team, and also thank Karen for pulling this together. And I'll look forward to seeing you in maybe 6 weeks or so.
That'd be great.
And be pretty exciting to come to Red Lake again. So hi, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.